Did you know there are countries where American tourists aren't exactly rolling out the red carpet in 2025? From political tensions to cultural misunderstandings, some destinations are closing their doors to travelers from the USA. Stick around to find out which countries made the list and why. Travel is one of the best ways to connect with the world, but not every destination is welcoming to American passport holders in 2025. Whether due to strained diplomatic relations, visa restrictions, or safety concerns, we've considered factors like visa policies, government advisories, and cultural climates to curate this list.
Country number 10.
Political instability in Venezuela makes travel risky. Anti-American sentiment is widespread in certain regions. The U.S. government has issued travel advisories for Venezuela. Visa applications for Americans are rarely approved. Economic collapse has worsened safety concerns for travelers. Reports of kidnappings and thefts involving foreigners are common. Access to basic amenities and services is limited for tourists. Diplomatic relations between the U.S. and Venezuela are strained. U.S. citizens often face hostility from local authorities. Limited consular services heighten the risks of travel. Political protests frequently disrupt public order. Americans are advised to avoid large gatherings or demonstrations. The infrastructure for tourism is poorly maintained. Travelers may encounter challenges due to currency restrictions. Venezuela remains a high-risk destination for American visitors.
Country number 9.
Iran has a history of strained relations with the United States. Americans face heightened scrutiny and potential arrest under espionage charges. The Iranian government often uses U.S. citizens as political leverage. Anti-American sentiment is deeply rooted in many parts of society. U.S. passports are treated with suspicion during the visa process. Americans have been detained for minor infractions or misunderstandings. U.S. citizens are banned from certain areas considered sensitive by the government. The absence of diplomatic relations limits consular support. American travelers face extensive monitoring by local authorities. Political tensions make travel to Iran risky for U.S. citizens. Cultural norms and strict laws may lead to unintentional offenses. The risk of imprisonment for Americans is notably high. Demonstrations against the U.S. can quickly turn violent. Travel advisories consistently recommend avoiding Iran. The country remains hostile and unwelcoming to Americans in 2025.
Country number 8.
North Korea is one of the most secretive nations in the world. Americans face extreme restrictions while visiting, including constant surveillance. Independent travel is not allowed. Tourists must stick to pre-approved itineraries. The U.S. has no diplomatic relations with North Korea. Americans are often viewed as political tools by the regime. Arrests of U.S. citizens for minor infractions are common. The government discourages any form of American influence within its borders. Internet access and communication with the outside world are nearly impossible. Criticism of the government, even inadvertently, can lead to severe consequences. Tensions between the U.S. and North Korea make travel highly risky. Americans are required to leave their phones and personal devices behind. Local guides monitor every action of U.S. travelers. Military zones and propaganda sites dominate the tourist experience. The U.S. State Department strongly advises against all travel to North Korea. North Korea remains one of the least welcoming places for Americans in 2025.
Country number 7.
Eritrea is known for its reclusive government and tight controls on visitors. Americans face strict restrictions, including limited movement. All tourists are required to obtain special permits for travel outside the capital. U.S. citizens are often monitored by government officials. Anti-American rhetoric is promoted by state-controlled media. The absence of a U.S. embassy complicates consular support for Americans. Independent journalism and free expression are heavily restricted. Americans are viewed as potential threats due to U.S. foreign policies. Communication and internet access are limited for visitors. Americans face challenges navigating Eritrea's strict cultural norms. Local laws are rigid, and violations can result in severe penalties. Travelers often encounter difficulties securing basic amenities. The U.S. State Department discourages non-essential travel to Eritrea. Hostile relations with neighboring countries make border areas dangerous. Eritrea remains an unwelcoming destination for Americans.
Country number 6.
Afghanistan continues to experience political turmoil under the Taliban regime. Americans are often targeted due to past U.S. involvement in the country. Strict Islamic laws make it challenging for U.S. travelers to adapt. Public criticism of the government can lead to severe penalties. The Taliban restricts the movement of foreigners, including Americans. Anti-American propaganda is widespread in Afghan media. The infrastructure remains damaged, making travel unsafe. Americans face heightened risks in rural areas controlled by militant groups. Cultural differences can lead to misunderstandings and hostility. Healthcare services are inadequate and unreliable. Public gatherings and protests can turn violent without warning. The absence of U.S. diplomatic support complicates consular assistance. Women travelers face additional restrictions under Taliban-imposed laws. Entry requirements for Americans are stringent and unpredictable. Afghanistan remains a high-risk destination for Americans in 2025.
Country number 5.
Yemen is in the midst of a devastating civil war. Americans are often viewed as targets for political leverage or ransom. Violent crime, including armed robbery, is widespread. U.S. travelers face risks from airstrikes, landmines, and conflict zones. Yemen has limited diplomatic relations with the United States. Kidnappings of foreigners are frequent in rural areas. Access to basic necessities, like water and food, is a significant challenge. Americans are advised to avoid areas controlled by militant groups. The healthcare system has collapsed, offering little to no support. Anti-American sentiment is fueled by perceptions of U.S. involvement in the region. Entry and exit procedures are unpredictable for U.S. citizens. Public gatherings can quickly escalate into violent clashes. Cultural sensitivities must be strictly observed to avoid confrontations. The U.S. State Department strongly advises against all travel to Yemen. Yemen remains a highly dangerous and inhospitable destination for Americans.
Country number 4.
Libya is deeply unstable, with multiple factions vying for power. Americans face heightened risks from terrorism and kidnappings. Anti-American sentiment is fueled by perceptions of past U.S. military actions. Travel advisories warn against all non-essential travel for U.S. citizens. Americans are often targeted by militias for ransom. The U.S. government has limited diplomatic presence in Libya. Infrastructure, including airports and roads, is in poor condition. Violent clashes between armed groups are frequent in urban areas. Americans face challenges accessing food, water, and medical care. Foreigners are closely monitored by local authorities. Entry and exit restrictions are unpredictable for U.S. travelers. Photography and public discussions can attract negative attention. Americans are advised to avoid coastal areas prone to piracy. Libya remains one of the least stable countries in the world. Travel to Libya is considered highly dangerous for Americans in 2025.
Country number 3.
Belarus has strained relations with Western countries, including the U.S. Americans are often viewed with suspicion by government authorities. The government heavily monitors foreign visitors, including Americans. Protests against the regime can result in mass arrests, including foreigners. Americans face challenges navigating Belarus's complex visa process. The lack of U.S. consular services increases travel risks. Anti-American sentiment is encouraged by state-controlled media. Surveillance and restricted movement are common for U.S. citizens. Americans may be accused of espionage for minor infractions. Political demonstrations and photography can attract legal trouble. Public transport and infrastructure are outdated and unreliable. Healthcare facilities are substandard for emergencies. Local law enforcement often targets foreigners for bribes or harassment. The U.S. State Department advises caution when traveling to Belarus. Belarus remains an unwelcoming destination for Americans in 2025.
Country number 2.
Somalia is plagued by ongoing conflict and lawlessness. Americans are often targeted for kidnapping by militant groups like Al-Shabaab. The U.S. government has limited diplomatic relations with Somalia. Travelers face a high risk of violent crime, including armed robbery. Piracy along the Somali coast poses additional threats to visitors. Americans are often viewed as symbols of Western interference. The infrastructure is severely underdeveloped, complicating travel. Healthcare facilities are nearly non-existent for emergencies. U.S. citizens face difficulty navigating the tribal and clan-based society. Even major cities like Mogadishu remain unsafe for foreigners. The Somali government has limited control outside urban areas. Cultural misunderstandings can escalate quickly, leading to hostility. Photography and public gatherings can attract unwanted attention. The U.S. State Department strongly advises against all travel to Somalia. Somalia remains one of the least hospitable places for Americans.
Country number 1.
Americans face challenges with strict laws and cultural restrictions in Saudi Arabia. Visa requirements for U.S. citizens are stringent. Public criticism of the government can lead to severe punishments. Women travelers face additional restrictions, especially if traveling alone. Americans have been detained for unintentional breaches of local laws. Diplomatic relations with the U.S. are strained at times. Americans face scrutiny from local authorities. Certain areas remain off-limits to non-Muslims, including U.S. citizens. Alcohol and other banned items can lead to serious legal trouble. Saudi Arabia is a challenging destination for Americans unfamiliar with its rules. While these countries might not be welcoming Americans in 2025, there are still countless destinations to explore that are eager to share their culture and beauty. Always research and respect local guidelines before planning your next adventure. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with fellow travelers. See you in the next one.